He extended his hand with a smile, but the billionaire didn't even glance up. "I don't shake hands with staff," the rich man said, waving him off like he was invisible. That one sentence would end up costing him $2 billion, but he wouldn't realize it until it was far too late. The sun had just begun to rise over the skyline when Derek Moore stepped out of the black car that brought him to the towering office building downtown. His suit was crisp, navy blue with a subtle pinstripe, his tie a deep burgundy that added a quiet weight to his presence. He paused for a moment outside the glass entrance, glancing up at the steel and mirrors above him. He'd been in buildings like this 100 times before. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just evaluating a company, he was testing the character of the man who ran it. Inside, everything gleamed: marble floors, gold accents, the faint smell of expensive cologne lingering in the air. A young assistant greeted him politely and led him to the 40th floor, where the private meeting would take place. Derek didn't say much during the elevator ride. He rarely did before meetings like this. He preferred to observe, to feel the energy of a place before speaking. The assistant smiled nervously, unsure of who Derek really was. That was always the interesting part. People assumed things based on skin, suit, and silence. When the doors opened, Derek was ushered into a sleek conference room with panoramic views of the city. The table was long, surrounded by white leather chairs and chrome fixtures. At the far end sat Richard Langston, the billionaire, the man everyone in finance either admired or feared. Known for his aggressive takeovers and ruthless drive, Richard had built his fortune by crushing competitors and cutting corners. His company was profitable, yes, but whispered about in quiet corners for its high turnover and toxic culture. Still, the numbers looked good on paper, and that's why Derek's firm had agreed to the meeting. But money alone wasn't enough. Not for Derek, not anymore. Derek walked in confidently, nodding to the others seated around the table. A few looked up and gave polite smiles, though most were still buried in their phones or talking among themselves. He made his way to Richard and extended his hand, his tone calm and friendly. "Good morning, Mr. Langston. Derek Moore." Richard glanced up for a brief second. He didn't rise, didn't smile. Instead, he gave a dismissive wave and muttered, "I don't shake hands with staff." Then he went right back to his phone, as if Derek had never spoken at all. The room fell into an awkward silence for a breath. Someone cleared their throat. Papers shuffled nervously. No one dared correct Richard. No one even blinked. It was the kind of moment that could pass by quickly if you let it, but Derek never let things like that slide. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't let anger show on his face. Instead, he smiled politely, nodded once, and took a seat near the end of the table. Not at the head, not at the center, just somewhere in the room, quiet, observing, taking mental notes. The others continued talking. Richard launched into his presentation without pause, clicking through slides about projected revenue, expansion plans, and market dominance. His voice filled the room, loud and confident, full of big ideas and bigger ego. Derek listened, his face unreadable. He'd seen this type before. Men who believed that power made them untouchable, that money gave them permission to be careless with people, and worst of all, men who assumed they could instantly identify who mattered in a room, based solely on how someone looked or where they sat. What Richard didn't know, what no one had told him, was that Derek wasn't there to take notes. He wasn't a junior analyst or an assistant. He wasn't someone's shadow. Derek Moore was the managing partner of a private equity firm that controlled over $10 billion in diversified assets. He had advised presidents, sat on the boards of Fortune 100 companies, and funded innovations that had changed entire industries. And he was also the decision maker for a $2 billion investment that Richard desperately needed to secure. But none of that mattered in that moment, not to Richard. All he had seen was a black man walking into his conference room with calm eyes and an outstretched hand. And that, to Richard Langston, meant one thing: staff. Derek didn't hold grudges. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that real power didn't shout, it listened, it watched, and it remembered. So, as Richard continued to talk over everyone in the room, brushing aside questions and ignoring the quiet discomfort spreading among his team, Derek just sat back, legs crossed, and took it all in. He wasn't angry. He was focused, because sometimes the real meeting doesn't begin until someone makes a mistake big enough to reveal who they really are. And that morning Richard had made his loud and clear, all with 7 words and an arrogant shrug: "I don't shake hands with staff." The rest of the meeting unfolded like most others Derek had attended over the years: charts, buzzwords, projections, and self-congratulating chatter. Richard Langston was in full performance mode, speaking fast and loud, tossing numbers around like candy, bragging about market domination and how his competitors were clowns in suits. He was the kind of man who didn't just want investors, he wanted fans, applause, obedience, people who would smile and nod while he did all the talking. But Derek wasn't that kind of man. He never had been. Derek listened quietly, barely moving, his notepad open but mostly blank. He wasn't here to be impressed by flashy language or ambitious forecasts. He wanted to see the foundation under all the polish. Was there integrity? Was their vision beyond profits? Did the person asking for billions have the mindset to handle it? That's what mattered to him. He had seen companies crash and burn because the leader at the top didn't know how to lead human beings, only numbers. And so far, Richard was proving to be exactly that type. About halfway through the meeting, one of Richard's junior partners, a woman named Kelsey, offered a question about employee retention. Derek's ears perked up. It was a good question. The firm's HR data had raised red flags during due diligence. High turnover, poor internal surveys, unusually high legal fees and settlements with former employees. This was Derek's moment to see if Richard had anything behind the curtain. But instead of answering, Richard laughed and waved the question off like it was a joke. Look, people come and go. This isn't summer camp, he said, smirking. We work hard, we win hard. If they can't handle the heat, they're free to leave. I don't lose sleep over people problems. The room was silent for a beat too long. Even Kelsey looked down at her papers, her cheeks flushing red. No one said anything. No one challenged him, but Derek noted it. That response told him more than any spreadsheet ever could. Culture came from the top, and when the top man didn't care who got burned, it meant the whole organization was at risk of collapsing the moment something went wrong. Derek had seen this pattern before. Flashy firms built on ego and aggression instead of humility and strategy. They rose fast, burned bright, and then fell apart in lawsuits, scandals, or PR disasters. He didn't invest in firestorms. He invested in steady flame leaders who knew how to light others up, not burn them out. As the meeting dragged on, Richard kept glancing at Derek, finally starting to realize something was off. The man who'd been brushed off as staff hadn't taken notes, hadn't asked a question, hadn't reacted to any part of the pitch. He just sat still, watching unbothered.com, and that made Richard nervous in a way he didn't understand. Power, real power, made men like him uncomfortable when it didn't show itself loudly. He liked control, and Derek clearly wasn't buying into the show. Eventually, someone from Richard's team leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Derek saw the billionaire's expression shift almost immediately. The smirk dropped, his back stiffened slightly. His eyes flicked toward Derek again, this time sharper. That was the moment he realized who Derek Moore really was. Not staff, not background, not someone to dismiss. He was the decision maker, the one holding the fate of this entire deal in his hands. There was a small stumble in Richard's next sentence, barely noticeable, but it was there. He tried to recover, adding a sudden comment about valuing diversity and empowering all voices on our team, but it was too late. Derek had already seen the real man behind the mask. One moment of arrogance had opened the door to the truth. Derek stayed silent until the end of the presentation. When Richard finally wrapped up, he looked directly at Derek, trying to mask his earlier disrespect with a forced smile. "Mr. Moore, I'd love to hear your thoughts," he said, voice polite now, even cautious. Derek leaned forward slightly and met his eyes. "Appreciate the presentation," he said simply. "We'll follow up." That was all. No feedback, no reaction, just a calm promise that a decision would come, but it would come later, and it wouldn't be in this room. Derek stood, collected his notes, still nearly blank, and offered a nod to the rest of the room. He didn't look at Richard again. Outside the conference room, the same assistant who had brought him up earlier was waiting to escort him to the elevator. This time she looked at him with a new kind of respect. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Moore," she said softly. He nodded, smiled, and said, "Thank you." He never needed to explain himself. People who saw clearly didn't need to shout. As the elevator doors closed, Derek glanced down at his notepad. He hadn't written a single number during the entire meeting. Just one line in the middle of the page. Character is louder than pitch. And with that, he knew what needed to happen next. 2 days passed before Richard Langston heard the news, but by then, it was already in motion. His assistant slid a printed email across the desk without a word. Richard looked at it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the header. The name at the top read, "More Capital Partners Investment Decision Update." It was short and formal, just 3 tight paragraphs. The message was clear. "After careful consideration, we have decided not to move forward with the proposed investment. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." Richard blinked, rereading it like the words might change, but they didn't. He read it again, slower this time. The $2 billion he had counted on, the capital injection that was supposed to fuel his next acquisition wave, was gone. Just like that. No negotiation, no questions, no second meeting, nothing. He slammed the email down and stood up, pacing behind his desk. "Get Moore on the phone," he barked. His voice echoed in the glass-walled office. The assistant hesitated. "Sir, they've already disengaged. There's no open line." He declined a follow-up. Richard stopped pacing. His jaw clenched. He wasn't used to hearing no, and certainly not like this. Quiet, final, cold. And he knew, without needing to be told, this wasn't about numbers. This was personal. Something had gone wrong, but not with a business plan. With him, he sat down heavily, trying to replay the meeting in his mind. The pitch had been strong. The projections were airtight. His reputation, his track record. So what was it? That's when it hit him. That moment, the hand, the man. Richard groaned and rubbed his face. At the start of the meeting, when Derek Moore had extended his hand, he hadn't even looked at him. He'd dismissed him as staff. That phrase, "I don't shake hands with staff," came back like a slap in his own face now. His stomach turned. How could he have been so careless? Back then, he thought he was just brushing off some junior employee, some assistant sent to take notes. It didn't matter to him who walked in if they weren't a partner or wearing a seven-figure smile. They didn't exist. That's how he operated. That's how he won. Or so he'd believed. But that man, that calm, silent, composed man, was Derek Moore, a name whispered with respect behind boardroom doors. A man who could move markets without speaking above a whisper. A man who had built a powerful investment firm from the ground up, guided not by ego, but by values. And Richard had humiliated him. Right there in his own boardroom. The worst part wasn't even the rejection. It was knowing that Moore hadn't yelled, hadn't confronted him, hadn't even corrected him. He just watched, observed, and remembered. That was real power, the power to remain still when everyone else moved to impress. By the afternoon, the fallout had already begun. One of Richard's key secondary investors pulled out, citing a strategic realignment. Another firm delayed a partnership meeting. A leak had made it to a niche financial blog, just a small blurb, nothing viral yet. But it said enough. More capital quietly pulls out of Langston. Deal sources say decision came after an uncomfortable meeting between executives. Richard knew how this worked. If word spread that Moore had rejected him not for financial reasons, but for something deeper like character, it would hurt far more than his funding round. It would hurt his image, his legacy. The myth of Richard Langston would start to crack. And in the business world, image was capital. Across town, Derek Moore sat in his quiet office with the blinds drawn halfway. His phone buzzed twice, his executive assistant forwarding to voicemails from Langston's office, both marked urgent. He didn't answer them. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat at his desk with his notebook open, the same one from the meeting. He stared at that one line he had written, "Character is louder than pitch." He believed that. It was how he built his career, not by chasing profit at any cost, but by aligning money with meaning. And that meant saying no, not just to bad numbers, but to bad people. He knew others would have stayed in that room and smiled, maybe even still invested because the return looked promising. But Derek had learned early on, when people see you as less, you don't correct them, you let them reveal themselves. Then you act accordingly. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from a fellow investor. He figured out who you were, panicking, trying to backtrack. "You good?" Derek smiled faintly and typed back. Let him sweat. We move on, because this wasn't just about a handshake. It was about principle. It was about what kind of people you empower when you write checks. Money gives people louder voices, bigger platforms, longer shadows. And Derek refused to fund a man who mistook decency for weakness. He closed the notebook and stood up, walking to the window. The city below moved with its usual buzz, people chasing deals, chasing power, chasing status. But Derek Moore had all of that already. And he knew the truth. What you do when no one's watching matters, but what you do when you think someone doesn't matter, that's what defines you. And Richard Langston had defined himself perfectly. The fallout came faster than anyone expected. Within a week of Moore Capital's withdrawal, Richard Langston's empire started to show its cracks. First, it was subtle. A delayed response from a European investment partner who had always been quick to reply. Then, a tech startup Richard had been courting quietly backed out of an acquisition deal. No official reason was given, just a change in strategic direction. But behind the scenes, the message was clear. People were pulling away from Richard not because of his numbers, but because of who he had shown himself to be. By the end of the second week, 2 more institutional investors suspended their talks with Langston Group, citing concerns about leadership alignment. The financial world was small, and word had traveled quickly. Derek Moore never went public. He didn't post about the incident. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't have to. People who mattered saw the move, read between the lines, and started asking questions of their own. Suddenly, Richard Langston wasn't just the bold billionaire anymore. He was the man who disrespected the most principled investor in the room and lost $2 billion because of it. Inside his own offices, Richard's leadership began to erode. Executives who had long endured his arrogance began to speak more freely behind closed doors. The silence he had always mistaken for loyalty was actually fear. And once that fear cracked, so did the illusion of control. Kelsey, the junior partner he had once laughed over during the Moore meeting, resigned quietly, citing misalignment with internal values. Her departure triggered a ripple effect. 2 more senior staff left the same week. What had once been brushed off as normal turnover was now clearly something deeper, and the media caught wind. The headline didn't come from a major outlet at first, just a business podcast blog that specialized in ethical investing. But it went viral. Disrespect has a price. Moore Capital walks. Langston empire wobbles. Within 24 hours, major publications picked it up. The coverage didn't attack Richard directly, but it didn't have to. The story was built around contrast. Derek Moore, the quiet power broker who built his empire on integrity, humility, and respect. Richard Langston, the billionaire who couldn't recognize who he was talking down to, and paid the price. Richard tried to do damage control. He issued a vague statement about miscommunication and how he deeply respected diversity at every level. But the words felt hollow, forced, too late. Investors weren't just watching his company's performance, now they were watching his character. And character, as it turns out, had real market value. Behind the curtain, Richard's PR team scrambled. Meetings were held late into the night. New social media posts were crafted to make him appear more human. Photos of him shaking hands, smiling with interns, touring community centers. But it all looked staged. The authenticity that Derek Moore carried so naturally couldn't be bought or faked. Meanwhile, Derek remained silent and focused. At Moore Capital, the team kept moving. They diverted the $2 billion initially reserved for Lang venture into 3 smaller investments, young companies led by innovative, grounded, respectful leaders. One of them was a black woman in her early 30s developing sustainable housing tech in Detroit. Another was a Latino founder working on clean water solutions for underserved communities. The third was a veteran-led cybersecurity startup reshaping data privacy. These weren't just investments. They were commitments to people, to purpose, to something that would last longer than flash and fame. Derek didn't care for headlines, but when one of the new founders he funded called him crying with gratitude after securing her first major office space, he knew he'd made the right choice. "They never took me seriously until they heard you were backing us," she'd said. "You changed everything." And that's what Derek always understood. Real influence isn't measured by how loud you speak, but by the lives you quietly lift. Back at Langston Group, the stress was boiling over. Richard's legal team was now reviewing 2 new internal complaints, HR cases that had been buried before but were now being revived under a harsher spotlight. Investors were hesitant, stockholders restless. The board had called an emergency review meeting. No one said it out loud, but Richard could feel it. They were thinking about replacing him. He stared out his office window at the same skyline that used to make him feel invincible. Now it just felt far away. Everything looked smaller. He remembered Derek's face in that meeting, calm, patient, not angry, just sure he had misjudged that man so badly. Not just his role, but his depth. Richard had assumed he was forgettable, just another quiet guy in a nice suit. But it turned out Derek Moore was the storm he never saw coming, the kind that didn't make a sound until it was already upon you. The bitter truth settled in Richard's chest. It had taken him a lifetime to build his name, and only a moment of arrogance to stain it. And Derek, he didn't need revenge. He didn't even need to explain. He had simply stood up, walked out, and let the world watch Richard fall under the weight of his own words. Months passed. The buzz around Richard Langston quieted, but the damage never fully healed. His company still operated, though it was a shadow of its former self. The board had forced him to step down as CEO, replacing him with a more people-focused executive. Stock prices had stabilized, but real trust was gone. Investors were cautious, partners distant, and the media no longer used words like visionary or trailblazer when they spoke about him. His legacy was now marked not by the billions he made, but by the billions he lost with one careless sentence, in one unforgettable moment. Meanwhile, Derek Moore moved with his usual quiet rhythm. He didn't gloat. He didn't look back. He never once mentioned Langston's name again, not in interviews, not in private meetings, not even in passing. He was already focused on what came next. The companies he'd chosen to fund in Langston's place were thriving, not overnight, not in flashy headlines, but in real, measurable ways. One expanded into 6 cities, another partnered with a global non-profit. The third had just landed a government contract that would change the lives of thousands. In every one of those deals, Derek showed up, not always in suits, not always with cameras. Sometimes he just walked through their offices, shook hands with every employee no matter the title, and asked how they were doing. Because that's who he was, a man who understood that people weren't numbers, that power meant nothing if it wasn't used to build others up. One evening, Derek sat alone in his office, the city glowing outside the window. A small framed quote sat on his desk, one his mother gave him when he first started in business. "How you treat the least of them says everything about who you are." He looked at it for a long moment, then closed his laptop. It wasn't about revenge. It had never been. It was about standards, about drawing lines in a world where too many people erased them for money. He didn't walk out of that meeting because of pride. He walked out because silence in the face of disrespect is agreement, and he had never, and would never, agree to that. The world moved on, as it always does. Richard Langston faded from headlines, but the story lived in boardrooms, in startup pitches, in quiet whispers between investors. A cautionary tale, a reminder that wealth doesn't make you wise, and titles don't make you decent. And somewhere in an office far away from flashing cameras and billion-dollar egos, a man named Derek Moore continued to do what he always did: invest in people. The kind who remembered what Richard forgot. Respect is free, but forgetting to give it can cost you everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and drop a comment below. Your voice matters. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that speak truth and inspire change.